internal, superior, inferior. Make sure you specify. And also vein and artery. So I can put down subclavian. We have subclavian veins and subclavian arteries, and we have left and right. Okay, so be specific. So get in the habit of doing that. Okay? If you have nothing to do this weekend, might want to take advantage of 2 hours. Okay? And everything should be in here. Guides, models. And the pigs. Don't forget the pigs. They will be fish on this weekend. They'll have time to look. They're all over here in the class.
Our exam is on Thursday.
Thursday, we can do that, huh? 31st of May. All right. We'll turn then to second page of your handout. Page number 5. Halfway down the page. Talk about respiratory system. First off, the components of respiration involve what's called pulmonary ventilation, which is a fancy name for breathing, moving air in and out of the lungs. It's called pulmonary ventilation, moving air in and out of the lungs. Inhaling, exhaling. Of course, the function of the respiratory system is to permeate the tissues, provide oxygen, and carry away or remove carbon dioxide. Of course, it works hand in hand with the respiratory system to do that. Or, excuse me, with the cardiovascular system to do that. Okay, once in the lungs, then, there's a process called external respiration occurs. This is gas exchange. It occurs in the lungs with the movement of oxygen from the air sacs into the blood vessels that surround them. And the movement of carbon dioxide from the blood vessels into the air sacs. That's called external respiration, gas exchange. You've got movement of gas, oxygen from the air sacs into the blood capillaries that surround those air sacs, and movement of carbon dioxide from the blood capillaries into those tiny little air sacs. And that in the lungs is called external respiration. Then, of course, you've got transport of those respiratory gases by the blood. And I think you know by now that the majority of the oxygen is carried out in the blood.
Red blood cells.
To the red blood cells, chemically bound to the hemoglobin, to the heme groups. Remember, there are 4 heme groups in each normal hemoglobin molecule, which means a hemoglobin molecule can carry up to 4 oxygen molecules. And since you have maybe as many as 250 million of these per red blood cell, that tells you that you have the potential of carrying 1 billion oxygen molecules in a red blood cell. When you consider that you've got something of order between maybe 4.5 to 6 million of these per cubic millimeter, and you may have somewhere between 4 and 6 million, or 4 and 6 liters of blood in the body, tells you the tremendous oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, which also tells you great oxygen demand as well. Okay. Outside the lungs and the other tissues, then, we have gas exchange occurring called internal respiration, and now the oxygen and carbon dioxide are going the opposite of what we saw before. Oxygen is now moving from the blood capillaries into the tissues. And those tissues are giving off carbon dioxide that's moving into the blood. So again, it's gas exchange is occurring in the tissues outside the lungs. Oxygen moving from the blood into those tissues, and carbon dioxide coming out of the tissues into the blood. And of course, the blood carries it back to lungs, and you repeat the process. Okay, so these are all components of respiration. All right, we're going to go through now the respiratory structures. As I said before, be prepared to trace through the respiratory system. You should be able to take air from the outside of the body to the little air sacs, which are called alveoli, which is where the gas exchange occurs. You can go in either direction, in or out. Remember, you're inhaling air and you're exhaling air. So I could say, okay, you've got air in this passageway. Where does the inhaled air go? Next passageway. Or exhale, so it's going to go the other way. So you need to be familiar, forward and backward, moving the air through those tubes of the respiratory tract. And we start with the nasal cavity. The air is usually taken in the nasal cavity. That's the cavity inside the nose. And the air usually comes in through the nostrils, fancy name, external nares. The nasal cavity itself is divided into left and right sides by a vertical partition called the nasal septum. And we talk about a septum between the right and left side of the heart, and an interatrial septum, which divides the right and left atrium, and also an interventricular septum dividing right and left ventricle. So a septum, again, is just a wall or partition. So in this case, the nasal septum is a vertical partition dividing the nasal cavity on the right and left sides. It's made up of two bones, parts of two bones, and also cartilage. What are the two bones? Oh, you learn this when you certainly learn these bones when you study the skull. What bones? What's the bone inside the nasal cavity? The ethmoid. Ethmoid. Okay, so we're picking up later the ethmoid. What else? There's another bone. The vomer. The vomer. So the vomer and the ethmoid. Okay. And then there's a cartilage as well. And if you look at a skeleton, of course, you don't see much of the bridge of the nose because most of the bridge of the nose is actually cartilage. So that erodes. What you see are just these tiny little nasal bones at the top. So usually when a person breaks their nose, they're just displacing cartilage. Okay? And you've heard of deviated septum, okay? So the septum gets pushed one side or the other. Okay? So again, usually when the nose is broken, you're displacing cartilage, unless you're talented like I am. I was in graduate school, I was taking lessons, ice skating lessons, and I did a three-point landing on the ice. Okay? Knee, elbow, and nose. And needless to say, I broke my nose. Okay? Got up and they felt, oops, crooked, broke a nose. So I was rushed to the emergency room, but they said, well, you want to go in now or you want to wait all morning? I said, now, before that swelling. Okay? So they took me in, and the plastic surgeon came in, and it's the first time in my life, and only time in my life, I've ever had cocaine. It was not a pleasant experience. I was laying on the table, and he dripped the cocaine into the nasal cavity, and it rolled right back, and of course, into my throat. So I felt like I had a big wad of cotton in my throat. It deadened the throat. But it didn't deaden the tissues in the nasal cavity. So when he stuck the needle in, deadened the tissues, I felt it. Believe me, I felt it. And then he proceeded to take his spatula device, stick it up my nostril, and start yanking and cranking. I could hear things breaking. I hope he knows what he's doing, so he doesn't rip the nose off my face. Unfortunately, I found out later he was highly regarded. In fact, he was considered the best plastic surgeon resident they had at the hospital. So I was fortunate in that sense. But it was not a pleasant experience.
Oh, I don't think I want to break mine.
You're probably a little more coordinated than I am.
I doubt it.
Okay. The nasal cavity is also further subdivided by bony projections into the nasal cavity that, of course, are covered by soft tissue. These are called the conchae, the nasal conchae. We have a superior, a middle, and an inferior pair. They project into the interior of the nasal cavity on both sides. What they do is they create passageways between them called the meatuses. So there's a superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae, concha singular, concha plural. Now this creates the superior, middle, and inferior meatuses. When you're studying the skull, you maybe learn that the meatus is a kind of like passageway, like the hole inside of your head here.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of auditory meatus. Okay? Now what this does is create a turbulent airflow. So the air is bouncing off the epithelium that lines the nasal cavity. And the nasal cavity itself is lined with pseudostratified, ciliated columnar epithelium. Pseudo means false. Okay? Stratified, what does that mean in reference to the epithelium? It means it's multiple cell layers, two or more, right? You can usually tell because you see the position of the nuclei. You really can't see the cell boundaries. You can see the position of the nuclei. So if you got two or more layers of nuclei, it usually means it's stratified. In this case, though, the nuclei are different levels because the cells aren't all the same height. They all come off a basement membrane, but they are different levels, so it appears to be stratified, but in fact it's not. So it's called pseudostratified.
And this is the lining of the nasal?
Pardon me?
The lining of the nasal cavity?
Lining of the nasal cavity, among other things that we'll mention in just a minute. Okay. So pseudostratified cells coming up here. Ciliated because the free surface, they're cilia. Not to move the cells, but to move something across the surface of the cells. And the cells are column-shaped, which means they're taller than they are wide. And you can tell because you look at epithelium, you look at the shape of the nuclei, it gives you an idea of the shape of the cell. The nuclei are flattened, that means squamous. The squamous cells, remember, are flat. If they're round nuclei, that usually means cuboidal. And if they're oval, which would be the case here, it means columnar. That's what you'll see. So pseudostratified, ciliated, columnar epithelium. Okay? There are also cells in that epithelium that secrete mucus. So you got a wet, sticky surface. What that does is trap dust and debris that's coming in with the inhaled air. It gets caught in the mucus, and then the cilia sweep it down to the throat. So it helps to filter the air. Okay, as you know, the nasal cavity is separated from the oral or mouth cavity by the palates. And they make up the floor of the nasal cavity or the roof of the oral cavity, which is the mouth. The anterior part is supported by a bony shell, so it's called the hard palate. That's the anterior part of the palates that separate the nasal and thoracic cavity. Okay. And by the way, if you got your textbook, some have it already open. What's the page number on that? 808. 808. You might want to turn it. You got your textbook handy. That shows you the cavity, the nasal cavity, and some of these structures within it. Also part of the pharynx or throat. Okay, so that's the hard palate. And that's formed by a bony shell formed by two bones. What are those bones?
The maxilla
Maxillary bones, okay.
and palatine.
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 Palatine and maxillary bones. Hard palate is continuous posteriorly with a soft palate, which is not have a bony support. It's connective tissue and muscle. So it's softer. Okay, so it has a little bit of give to it. The posterior end of that soft palate kind of droops down and hangs down in the throat. And that's called the uvula. The purpose of the uvula is to flip up when you swallow so food doesn't go up your nasal cavity. So sometimes you got food in your mouth and you're chewing it, you got sneeze. Okay, what does that do? Sometimes it blows those food particles right up in your nasal cavity out your nostrils. So there's a connection. Or they got an effervescent or really bubbly carbonated beverage, sometimes it'll go up. And the bubbles will come right out of your nostrils. Okay, but for the most part, the uvula is pretty good about keeping stuff out of your nasal cavity. Unfortunately, also, it serves another purpose, well, not really a purpose, but serves something else that occurs as a result of it. When we sleep, of course, our muscles relax, including the uvula. So it will vibrate in the breathe, especially if you're breathing with an open mouth, okay? And that's what gives rise to the noise that we call snoring. And since the uvula is a little bigger in males, okay, the muscles are bigger, they tend to be a little noisier. Your man, you know, there's somebody next to you, they kick you in the ribs suddenly, you know, roll over. Go onto the couch here, you're making too much noise. I mean, yeah.
So people that have that removed, do they constantly have problems with their breathing?
Well, you can handcuff them. But sometimes they will just for that purpose, they can. You can reduce the noise. Because when you're irritating, you know, so somebody be next to you, okay? Okay. Paranasal sinus. I think you know, you've heard of these before when you're studying the skull. These are natural cavities in bone of the skull. And what it does is basically reduce the weight of the skull. The paranasal sinuses are named for the bone in which they're found. And they are lined with the same type of epithelium that lines the nasal cavity. So in other words, it's pseudostratified, ciliate epithelium. And again, it's mucus secreting. And since they don't drain very well because of an upright posture, sometimes they get clogged. And that's why you may have these pressure points or these so-called sinus headaches. They build up the mucus, not drain. It's pressure, and the pain receptors, you feel that as pain in various parts of the face or the skull. The ethmoid sinus, of course, would be in the ethmoid bone. They're sometimes called ethmoid air cells. The frontal sinus is in the frontal bone, which makes up the forehead. You can see here on this top model right here, and also on those models over there, the side of the head. Except now you're looking on the other side of the opposite blood vessels. But you can see here, this would be the frontal sinus. Okay, that's the one right up here. That's of course a mid-sagittal section. This is a frontal or frontal section. The ones right here, the cheek region, those would be the maxillary sinuses. maxillary bones. You see a little bit of the frontal sinus here, almost look like eyebrows. These are the orbital cavities where the eyeball would be. That's going to be right in here, okay, in the nasal cavity. And then we have another sinus here in the sphenoid bone. That's the sphenoid sinus. That's a little deeper in the skull. That's that weird-looking bone. It looks like a
Pterodactyl.
yeah, or a bird out of a nightmare or something like that. It has the greater, lesser wings and so on. So this is the sphenoid sinus. And notice there's a little depression here, just above the sinus, in that sphenoid bone, in which the pituitary gland sits. Anybody remember the name of that?
Remember the name of what?
The what? Yes, very good. The sella turcica, Turk saddle. That protects the pituitary gland. It sits right down in here. Okay? But the cavity just below that is the sphenoid sinus. So take a look at these models and see. Now those don't, of course, have the choroidal plane, but you can see the frontal sinus here and also the sphenoid sinus. Okay? And again, these little projections here, these are the conchae. Superior, middle, nasal conchae, and then the meatuses that they form. Okay? We're going to take a look at them. Okay, so turn to the next page, page 6. On your lab objective sheet here. The pharynx is a technical name for throat. This is one of the most mispronounced words. It is not pharynx, it is pharynx. Look how it's spelled. Okay? And it's divided into 3 regions. The superior part is called the nasopharynx. This is the part of the throat just posterior to the nasal cavity. Okay? And I skipped over a term, yeah. Go back to page 5 under the under superior, middle, and inferior meatuses, it says internal layers. Okay, this is the opening from the nasal cavity into the nasopharynx. It's also called the posterior nasal aperture. Okay, so air comes in through the external nares into your nasal cavity, and then is expelled from the nasal cavity into the nasopharynx by the internal nares, or posterior nasal aperture.
What did you say, opening from the nasal cavity into the what?
It's the opening from the nasal cavity into the nasopharynx. That's the internal nares, or posterior nasal aperture. Okay? All right, the superior part again of the throat is called the nasopharynx. And this is lined with the same kind of epithelium that we see in the nasal cavity and paranasal sinuses, namely the suprastratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Now in that region we have openings to 2 tubes that connect the pharynx or throat to the middle ear. And remember the middle ear, that's where we have those 3 little bones, the malleus, incus, and stapes, better known as the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, which basically conduct impulses from the tympanic membrane or eardrum, which vibrates, of course, and sound waves hit it, into the inner ear, which is where your organs of hearing are found. Okay? Why do you want a connection between the pharynx and the middle ear? Since often this can be a route by which bacteria can migrate from the throat up into the middle ear. And especially in children, it starts with a sore throat, and pretty soon they got a middle ear infection. Why do you want those tubes or passageways? Yes, to equalize the pressure on either side of the eardrum, to reduce the risk of rupturing the eardrum. Okay? And these tubes go by different names. Eustachian tubes, pharyngeal tympanic membrane, auditory tube, it's up to you. The pharyngeal tympanic tube, rather. It's all listed there. So you can use any of those 3 terms. But again, it helps you equalize pressure on either side of the eardrum to reduce the risk of it being ruptured. And if you get up in the airliner and you descend, you often feel pressure on your ears, okay? And you often clear by what? Squeezing your nose, nostrils, and then blow out. You often administer a squeezing sound when it relieves the pressure. Unfortunately, next to you, the lady with her baby, and the baby's screaming because it's got the pressure, okay? And mother's trying to, give it a pacifier or suck on the bottle to hopefully relieve that pressure. You ever done any diving? When you go underwater, since water's a much denser medium than air, just a few feet, and you start to feel the pressure in your ear. If you're a scuba diver, if you can't clear, you don't dive. but it's like a couple of spikes being driven in the side of your head. If you ignore it, what will happen eventually is, you don't clear, because of pressure, it can rupture that eardrum, then you got water coming right in that middle ear, right down your station tubes, and right into your throat. You won't be dying at all, okay? But even dive in the bottom of a swimming pool, you can feel the pressure up there. Okay? Because about every 33 feet in salt water, you got another atmosphere of pressure on the bottom. And in fresh water, about every 35 feet. Okay. Pharyngeal tonsils, also the nasal cavity. We mentioned that before. Okay, that's right up here, pharyngeal tonsil. And by the way, the little grooves in there, that'd be the opening of the eustachian tube or auditory tubes from nasopharynx into the middle ear. The middle portion of the pharynx is called the oral pharynx. That's what's posterior or behind the oral cavity or mouth. You can see here the opening between the oral cavity and the oropharynx has a fancy name. It's called the fauces. And in the oropharynx we have tonsils again. The palatine tonsils, and you can see on the models, there's lobes of tissue once you want it, if you want that anyway. Palatine tonsil, and the tonsil that base of the tongue, which is called the lingual tonsil. Lingual refers to tongue. Okay? These are in the oropharynx. Now, in the oropharynx, the epithelium changes. It becomes non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And that's because the oral cavity and the oropharynx, which is right behind it, handle not only air, but also food and drink. So you want a good, thick, protective layer. So non-keratinized stratified squamous. Okay, it's similar to skin, except it's not keratinized, which means it's living cells right to the surface. It's a mucous membrane. Okay, just inferior to the oropharynx is the laryngopharynx. And the laryngopharynx also is lined with a non-keratinized stratified squamous, because it too handles food and drink as well as air. So the throat, basically, except for the nasopharynx, is made up of or lined with non-keratinized stratified squamous, because it's carrying not only air, but also food and drink. You want a good, thick, protective layer. Nasopharynx, the superior part of the throat, usually only handles air. That's why it's the pseudostratified ciliary clumber epithelium. Okay. All right, from the throat, or pharynx, then, we go into the larynx. The common name for the larynx is the voice box, because it contains pores of tissue which vibrate as the air passes over them, which allow us to make sounds. So this model represents the larynx, this part here. Okay? The lower part here is the trachea, to which it is attached. And the trachea is also known as the windpipe. Okay? Now, most of the respiratory passages are supported by a piece of cartilage in the wall. So it's to help keep the nasal passageways, respiratory passageways open. We start right here with the larynx. Now the larynx has 9 cartilages, 3 single cartilages, which are the larger cartilages, and 3 pairs of smaller cartilages. And they're listed there in your handout. Okay? So, under the larynx, okay, it says glottis and epiglottis, and then it says thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, and then it says a retinoid, perniculate, and cuneiform. And notice in parentheses it says 2. Those are the paired ones. 2 means that there are 2 of them. Now let's go through these cartilages. I'm expecting you to know these, so you can identify them. All right, the first cartilage, which is the big one here, right in front, it's labeled number 2 on the model, sort of shield shape. This is the thyroid cartilage. The thyroid cartilage. It's labeled number 2 on the model. Okay? Based on this model. And again, there's a diagram in your book on page 810. Nice picture of the larynx. Okay? So again, this is the thyroid cartilage. It's got a bump right here in front, which is called the laryngeal prominence, and it's commonly referred to as the Adam's apple. You can feel it in your throat. We all have one, male and female, but it's larger in males because they have larger cartilages in their larynx. Okay, if you put your finger on that bump and you swallow, does it move? Which way? Swallow. Should move up, yeah. It moves up because you've got muscles that actually pull the larynx up and bring the opening, okay, into the larynx from the throat, called the glottis, in contact with a proper tissue called the epiglottis. What this does is close off the glottis so food slides down into the esophagus and not into the larynx, where it can block the respiratory passageway. Okay? So if you open this thing up with model, you will see there's a cartilage right here, and that's what supports the epiglottis. And again, the epiglottis is the flap of tissue that covers the glottis when we swallow. So when we swallow, not only does the uvula flip up and keep food from going up the nose, but your epiglottis covers the glottis so food goes down to the esophagus as intended and moves to the stomach instead of down into your larynx where it can block the respiratory passageway. Okay? And sometimes you're laughing and talking, okay? You can have food in your mouth and chew it, but don't try to swallow and take a breath at the same time. And sometimes when you're laughing and talking, you're not paying attention. You swallow, and it goes down the right tooth, wrong tooth. And you know right away because you're doing this coughing spasm to get rid of it, okay? Sometimes in a restaurant, okay, the person next to you may be like this, okay? They probably got something that went down the glottis into the larynx, and it's blocking the airway. That's the time for the Heimlich maneuver, okay? You put your arms around them from back, under the rib cage, and yank up. What you're doing basically is forcing the diaphragm up, and hopefully enough pressure to force that whatever it's blocked. Often a piece of meat, and goes flat across the restaurant. Sometimes it's somebody's plate, but at least you saved that person. Okay?
Yeah.
And sometimes it happens. It does happen. We see that. Being a nurse, you should be able to do the Heimlich very easily. I can save a person's life. Okay, so we have two cartilages here that are single. The thyroid cartilage and the epiglottal cartilage. The third single cartilage is called the cricoid cartilage. And that's this one right here. And that marks the inferior boundary of the larynx. And it's labeled number 3 on this model.
Can't see.
It's this one right here. Okay? Again, if you have a diagram in your book there, take a look at it. That's called the cricoid cartilage. And it expands posteriorly. You actually see more of it from behind than you do anteriorly. Behind is covered by muscle. The model has been stripped away on one side so you can see that in fact there is a cartilage beneath that muscle. That's the cricoid cartilage. So those are the 3 large unpaired cartilages. Thyroid cartilage, the epiglottal cartilage, sometimes just called the epiglottis, and then the cricoid cartilage, which is this one. Okay. Now we have 3 pairs of small cartilages. And the first one is this one here, sort of the shape of a right triangle. And you can only see one of them because it's actually covered by muscle, but they stripped away the muscle on one side so you can see there's cartilage there. That's called the arytenoid cartilage, labeled number 4 in the model. The arytenoid cartilage. There are 2 of those. It's roughly the shape of a right triangle. Everybody know what a right triangle is? Okay. Right here. And attached to that and just superior to it is another little triangular piece of cartilages. These are called the corniculate cartilages. Corniculate. They're labeled number 5 on the model. Corniculate cartilages. Okay. And they're attached to and just superior to the arytenoid cartilages. But much smaller. And the third pair of small cartilages are up here. It's labeled number 6. These bumps up here. Those are the cuneiform cartilages. Cuneiform. So again, we got a pair of arytenoid cartilages, a pair of corniculate cartilages, and a pair of cuneiform cartilages, all in this model. 4, 5, and 6 in that order. Okay. So take a look at the model and make sure you can identify these cartilages. And again, the glottis is the opening of the throat into the larynx. The epiglottis is flap of tissue that covers the glottis when we swallow. outside. The larynx, of course, is called the voice box because you've got cords of tissue that run across the opening. Now, we've actually got two pairs. The superior pair are called the vestibular folds, also called the false vocal cords because they're not involved in sound production. What they do is they come together, they help to keep things from going down into the respiratory tree. And also, when you're holding your breath, they tend to come together. So they aid in breath holding. But they have nothing to do with sound production. They're called false vocal cords of vestibular folds. You can use either term. Inferior to that are a pair of cords here, which are elastic, and they vibrate when air passes over. Those are the vocal folds, or true vocal cords. And just like the strings of a stringed instrument that vibrate, that's what creates the sound. And the tone of the sound, or the tone of your voice, has to do with resonance chambers, just like in a stringed instrument. Stringed instrument, you don't just have the strings, but you've also got a little cavity below that, the resonance chamber. The resonance chamber here is your nasal cavity, the oral cavity, paranasal sinuses, and the throat. And as you know, a person's voice is very distinctive. And you can recognize a person if you know them well, and you don't see them, just by that distinctive sound of the voice, the tone of quality. And also, too, when a person has an upper respiratory infection or maybe allergy, there's a lot of mucus secretion, the tone and quality of the voice changes because you change the volume of those resonance chambers where they have mucus accumulation. And there's also a little cavity between the vestibular folds, the superior ones, and the vocal folds, the inferior ones. And unfortunately, it's called the ventricle. Okay? It's the ventricle. Okay? So the ventricles are hard chambers, but they're also a little cavity between the
There's just one?
vestibular. Yeah, well, actually, it's on both sides. Actually, it's continuation on both sides, left and right.
So it's just one big one?
So it's this thing right here.
Oh,
Okay?
oh, okay.
That looks like a little slit between the cords.
Oh, just a small one.
Okay, the trachea. This represents the trachea. The trachea is a tube. It too is supported by cartilages. It looks like rings of cartilage, but in fact it's not rings. They're C-shaped piece of cartilage, as you can see. They're C-shaped. The cartilage here, by the way, all the cartilage in the respiratory passageways, with one exception, is hyaline cartilage, which remember is the most common type of cartilage in the human body. What are the other two types of cartilage in the human body? What?
Costal? Costal.
Okay. Fiber cartilage, fiber cartilage, which has a lot of collagen fibers running through it, very tough cartilage. We find in areas where there's a lot of stress. A good example of fiber cartilage would be where? No?
Like a ribcage?
That's costal cartilage.
Between the vertebra, the intervertebral disc. That's fiber cartilage. And also the pubic symphysis between the two pubic bones. Okay? And of course that will loosen, becomes a very flexible joint late in pregnancy to facilitate the passage of the baby through the birth canal. But also makes for a rather unstable platform. That's why a woman late in pregnancy may not be very stable because those hips basically are flexing. And sometimes a woman is going to be just kind of collapse. Okay? But there's a purpose for that. Like I say, it's to make the hip or the pelvic girdle basically flex so it can facilitate the passage of the baby. What's the third type of cartilage?
Elastic.
Elastic. And where's a good example of elastic cartilage?
In between the.
Right, the pinna, part of the outer ear. And the other?
You have some in between your discs. In between the cartilage.
The other one is right here. It's the epiglottis. That's the only elastic cartilage in the respiratory tract. Epiglottis. All the rest are hyaline cartilage. Okay, so that's very flexible, the epiglottis. Okay, as I said, the piece of cartilage, which again are hyaline cartilage that support the trachea, are C-shaped. Between the ends of the C of the cartilage, you have some soft tissue. It's muscle, a little bit of connective tissue. That muscle is called the trachealis muscle. When that muscle contracts, what it does is narrow the lumen of the trachea. Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to narrow this respiratory passageway, the trachea? What?
When you swallow food.
Well, when you do this, what happens to the force of what's passing through? Like vasoconstriction, that's the blood in a constricted vessel.
Peristalsis?
It increased the pressure. So what this does, it increases the air pressure flowing through. And usually this happens when you cough. Usually you're coughing to expel something that's gone down or some irritant. And by a narrower tube here, what you do is you get more forceful expulsion of air and more likely to force out whatever went down when you're trying to come out. Okay? So that's called the trachealis muscle. It's smooth muscle and it runs between the open ends of the C-shaped piece of cartilage in the trachea. Okay? And also pseudostratified ciliary epithelium. The epithelium again in the trachea is like it was in the nasal cavity and nasopharynx. Pseudostratified ciliary epithelium. And actually, I told you the oropharynx and laryngopharynx, and actually the superior part of the larynx, superior to the vocal folds, it's all non-cured, non-stratified space. The inferior vocal folds, then it goes back to pseudostratified ciliary clunder and continues in the trachea and the major respiratory passageways like the bronchi. Okay? And again, means it's got the cilia, it's got mucus-secreting cells. And by the way, the cells that secrete the mucus are listed there under trachealis muscle. Under pseudostratified ciliary epithelium. Goblet cells. Goblet cells are unicellular glands embedded in the epithelium of the pseudostratified ciliary epithelium. So they produce mucus, which gives you a wet, sticky surface to trap debris. So the goblet cells, their function is to secrete mucus. And again, they're embedded in the epithelium, they're but a single cell, so it's a unicellular gland. So that's the function of the goblet cell. All it does is secrete mucus. You'd be surprised the answers I get when I ask the function. Regulate blood pressure. You know, it doesn't regulate blood pressure. Okay. All right. I get a variety of very creative answers, but all the goblet cells do is secrete mucus. Okay. We've also got a set of multicellular glands in the wall of the trachea, and these are called seromucus glands. They're multicellular, and they're in the connective tissue deep to the epithelium. They also contribute to the mucus. So the goblet cells are single-cell glands embedded in the epithelium, and the seromucus glands are multicellular glands in the connective tissue, deep to the epithelium, in the tracheal wall. Okay, so both of them are sorts of mucus. And the mucus, of course, gives you a wet, sticky surface to trap debris coming in with the air, and then the cilia, again, sweep it to the pharynx. So the trachea could be sweeping up in the nasal cavity or nasal pharynx, it's sweeping it down to the throat. Then you can either spit that out or swallow it, a little extra protein. But it's filtering the air. That's what it's doing. Okay? If you're a smoker, you kill the ciliary activity. That's why a smoker, the first thing they do in the morning before they light that first cigarette is cough. You're going to develop chronic bronchitis. You can be assured. Because you got to clear a lot of the debris that's accumulated overnight. You don't have the ciliary action a person, a non-smoker would have. Okay? So if you're a smoker, you're going to expect to develop an alcohol COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, chronic bronchitis, and very likely emphysema as well. Okay, and you see these people walking around the portable tanks or the oxygen generators, okay, and they take it out and then they shoot puffs from the cigarette and put it back in again. And you laugh, and I had a couple of relatives who were like that, smokers. I am not a smoker. If you live with a smoker, and I grew up with a smoker, my dad was a heavy smoker, about 5 packs a day in his prime. Yeah, you can imagine. And I was living up north, and up north in the winters, you're riding around a car, you got to have those windows up when it's 20 below zero. And if you're sitting there with a smoker and they're puffing away, you can imagine what the inside of the car is like. With the windows up? And the windows up, yeah. So it's 20 below zero, you don't want those windows down, right? And in the northern winter, it's not uncommon to have sub-zero temperatures, not sub-freezing, but sub-zero. Wisconsin, Minnesota. What? Yes, it's quite cold. People around here, it gets cold when it's 40 degrees. 40 degrees, that's not cold. Up north in Wisconsin, it's 20 degrees, people are washing their cars, you know. If it's above freezing, yeah, they're out there washing their car, they're sunning themselves, you can imagine that. You know, a little crazy, but anyway. Okay. The trachea then divides into a bronchi. Here we have a model, and now you're looking at our blood vessels, but also the respiratory passage. And they're shown here in kind of a gray and white color. The gray represents the piece of cartilage. And you can see the trachea is coming down here. It then splits into two branches. And those are called primary bronchi. Bronchi is plural, bronchus is singular. So these go into either the right or the left lung. So you got a right primary bronchus and a left primary bronchus. They very quickly divide into smaller respiratory passageways called secondary bronchi or lobar bronchi, because they go into the lobes of the lungs. Now in humans, the right lung is larger than the left lung. Why? The position of the heart. The heart is more to the left of the midline, so there's less space for the left lung. See, the heart is over here. Okay? So in humans, the right lung has 3 lobes, and the left lung has only 2 lobes. So the lobes here would be the superior, middle, and inferior lobes in the right lung, and just the superior and inferior lobes in the left lung. But the respiratory passageway they carry there in and out of the lobes are the secondary bronchi, or lobar bronchi. So you have 3 on the right side, and only 2 on the left side. These are the secondary bronchi. The secondary bronchi then divide into smaller passageways called tertiary bronchi, which are also known as segmental bronchi, because they serve the segments in the lung. The lungs are highly compartmentalized, which is good because it helps to wall off things that get into the lungs, like an infection. You can have an infection in the lung, and it's more difficult to spread because of the connective tissue basically forms these segments. Okay, so again, trachea splits into the primary bronchi, right and left. They in turn split into the secondary lobar bronchi, 2 on the right and 2 on the left. They feed the lobes. And then they further subdivide into these, which would be the tertiary bronchi. And they supply the so-called segments of the lungs. Now the tertiary bronchi continue to divide into smaller and smaller tertiary bronchi. There's something in order of about 23 orders of branching. So it's very extensive. And you'll sometimes see the respiratory passageways referred to as the respiratory tree. Because you can see the passageway, the trunk of the tree would be the trachea. Major branches that would be the bronchi, primary bronchi, secondary, and tertiary, like a tree. Okay? So I'd like to be able to recognize this on the model. Right. Now, the tertiary bronchi eventually divide into smaller passageways called bronchioles. And the bronchioles are basically very tiny. They're only about a millimeter or less in diameter, so extremely small. We don't really see them on that model. And they divide into what are called terminal bronchioles, which are only about a half a millimeter or less in diameter. And they branch into what are called the respiratory bronchioles, which are about the same size as the terminal bronchioles. And the respiratory bronchioles give off the alveolar ducts, and they end in a big cluster of alveoli, which are the air sacs, and what's called an alveolar sac. And think of the alveolar sac, okay? And some of you on the page that you've seen there, on page 814, okay, it shows these passageways at the terminal end. So again, terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and then ending this big cluster of alveoli called an alveolar sac. So think of the alveolar sac like a bunch of grapes. That'd be the alveolar sac, and the individual grapes would be the alveoli. So it's a big cluster of air sacs. And it's across the walls of the alveoli, air sacs, that gas exchange occurs. Okay, we've already been over the lobes of the lungs. Now the lungs themselves are surrounded by a serous membrane called the pleura. And a serous membrane we saw around the heart, remember? You had a parietal and a visceral pericardium. Here you've got a parietal and visceral pleura. The parietal part always lines a cavity. In this case, it'd be the thoracic cavity. And the visceral part, the visceral pleura, would cover the surface of the lungs. Just like we saw with the parietal pericardium, remember, lined the fibrous pericardium, a cavity. And then the visceral pericardium cover the surface of the heart. It's considered part of the heart wall. So here we have the parietal pleura lining the thoracic cavity. The visceral pleura covering the surface of the lungs. They secrete fluid called pleural fluid. There's a little space called the pleural space. And because they're wet, they stick together. When things get wet, they tend to stick together. Which is why when you expand the thoracic cavity, you also expand the lungs, which is involved in breathing. Okay? They stick together. Pleurisy is simply an inflammation of a pleura. If you ever had pleurisy, you remember it because it's like having a knife stabbed in your chest. It's very painful. And it results when you don't have enough of a pleural fluid, because the pleural fluid acts like a lubricant. When you're breathing, of course, these membranes are rubbing across one another. There's a friction that can be very painful. Pleurisy. And sometimes stress will bring this on. Okay? Some of the courses, these tough courses can do that. Not this course, obviously. Some of the courses, like maybe stress out a little bit, and sometimes people get pleurisy as a result of it. Okay, the diaphragm. The diaphragm, of course, is a band of skeletal muscle that runs between or separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. That's one of the so-called respiratory muscles. It's very important in breathing. If the diaphragm is paralyzed, you can't breathe on your own. And sometimes when a person has an injury involving the neck, like a broken neck, they end up on a respirator because there's a nerve that runs down and innervates the diaphragm that runs through the neck, and that's called the phrenic nerve. If that nerve is damaged or severed, your diaphragm is paralyzed, and you're going to be on a respirator. You may and sometimes following a accident, particularly motorcycle accident, where the rider's thrown and hits something. It's not uncommon to have hand injuries and sometimes a broken neck, and they often end up on a respirator as a result. Question?
I have a question about pleurisy. How do they treat it? Just an anti-inflammatory or
Usually,
just
yeah.
wait?
Then it's inflammation. Okay, and you may remember a man by the name of Christopher Reeve, big hunk of a guy, and he played in some of the Superman movies, remember? You may also remember when he was paralyzed, he was into jumping horses, and he was thrown from a horse and broke his neck, and he ended up quadriplegic in a wheelchair. And he basically had no movement, no control of muscles below his neck. And he was on a respirator initially because, again, there was damage to that phrenic nerve and his diaphragm was paralyzed. He eventually gained control of some of the muscles, but never completely. And of course, he's not with us anymore. He passed away. But again, when you damage that nerve, the phrenic nerve, that will basically paralyze the diaphragm. But remember, skeletal muscle in the body, it only contracts when it's stimulated. And the natural way of stimulation, of course, is a somatic motor neuron. Stimulate. If that nerve, okay, with those nerve fibers is damaged, that muscle can end up, even though it's healthy, being basically not functional. Can't contract. Okay, conducting zone and respiratory zone. Notice when it says structures and what they connect to. As I mentioned before, I'm expected to trace through the respiratory system. So, would you like to go through that? Yeah. All right. First off, the conducting zone, as the name suggests, conducts air to and from the respiratory zone. And there's no gas exchange in the conducting zone. Simply conducting air to and from the respiratory zone to which it's connected. In the process of conducting air to and from the respiratory zone, it also warms the air, it humidifies or moistens the air, and it filters or cleanses the air. So the air you take in your lungs tends to be warmer, wetter, and cleaner than it was when you inhaled. If you're a smoker, it's going to be dirtier because you don't have the ancillary reaction. And secondly, of course, in the smoke itself, there's a lot of debris. And that will accumulate in the respiratory passageways too, which can interfere with gas exchange. Which is why a smoker doesn't aerate their blood as well. And to make matters worse, there's carbon monoxide in the smoke, and carbon monoxide has a greater affinity for the hemoglobin than does oxygen, so basically you're shutting down a lot of the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood as well. And to make matters worse, nicotine is a vasoconstrictor, which means it reduces blood flow to a lot of areas, including the heart. And that's why smoking takes a toll and puts a strain on a lot of your organs. And of course, you're much more susceptible to respiratory infections if you're a smoker. Okay? And hopefully you're not. If you are, you should quit as soon as possible,
Amen.
especially going into a medical field. I hate to see doctors and nurses out there puffing away. And I understand, I've been told, that Winter Haven Hospital no longer hires smokers in doctors and nurses.
And they don't have smoking on the,
Yeah, there's no smoking on the premises.
Mm.
So, and apparently if they know you're a smoker, they may not even hire you.
I think it's in the contract, like,
Yeah.
if they find out you are, then you're
Right,
automatically
but it's just as
terminated.
well, because it's, you should be smoking, and you should know better anyway, especially doctors. You would
I have a
think.
brother-in-law who's a nurse, and he smokes, and
He does?
he's 6'1" and weighs 130 pounds.
Okay, how old is he?
65,
65.
64, something like
Okay.
that. He's in terrible health, terrible. And my husband talks to him all the time and says, well, have you quit smoking? Because he complains about aches and pains and breathing. He said, well, have you quit smoking? Well, have you quit smoking? I'm trying.
Well, it's tough, it's a drug addiction, basically, it's really hard to break the habit. Anyway. Okay, so the conducting zone we start with the nasal cavity. And from the nasal cavity, where do we go? To the nasopharynx, okay? The nasopharynx. From nasopharynx to what?
Eustachian tube?
Oropharynx.
Oh,
You don't need to worry about the holes, all right? You just ask the tubes, the passageways. Okay, nasal cavity, nasopharynx, oropharynx. And that connects to what? Laryngopharynx, okay? And then don't skip the larynx. People have done laryngopharynx and they jump right to the trachea. Because then laryngopharynx is part of the pharynx, part of the throat. It's not part of the larynx. Okay? So again, nasal cavity, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, larynx. And again, it's larynx, not larynx. Then trachea. Then the primary bronchi. Then secondary or lobar bronchi, you can use either term. Secondary or lobar bronchi. And then tertiary or segmental bronchi. And from there into the bronchioles.
I'm sorry, from there to where bronchioles?
The tertiary bronchi to bronchioles.
Okay.
And then bronchioles to terminal bronchioles. That is the end of the conducting zone. That's why they're called terminal bronchioles, but it's not the end of the respiratory tree. Terminal bronchioles then connect to respiratory bronchioles, which is the beginning of the respiratory zone. Respiratory bronchioles to alveolar ducts. Alveolar ducts and blindly in alveolar sacs, which are clusters of alveoli. Okay, so again, the respiratory zone is respiratory bronchioles, alveolar duct, alveolar sac. It's a cluster of alveoli. And the respiratory is so called because this is where gas exchange occurs. Beginning of the respiratory bronchioles, continuing in the alveolar ducts, and of course the alveoli, alveolar sacs, the clusters of these alveoli. Okay? So again, you should be able to trace through the outside of the body to the alveoli. Conducting zone into the respiratory zone and back. You can go either way. They say, okay, the air is in a bronchiole, you inhale the air, what would it pass into next from a bronchiole? I'm asking you a question.
Terminal bronchiole.
Yeah, very good. Terminal bronchiole. Okay, if it's in a bronchiole and it's exhaled air, what would it pass into next?
Tertiary.
Tertiary bronchus, tertiary bronchus, okay? That's what I mean. It will trace it either way. Okay. Any questions? Again, respiratory zone, this is where gas exchange occurs. And that's because starting with the respiratory bronchioles, you have alveoli coming off the walls. And that's where gas exchange occurs. These tiny little air sacs called alveoli. And unfortunately, alveoli also include sockets. And you may remember that. And we're going to see you get to the mammary glands, the breast, alveoli also there as well. Any questions?